following is a conversation with Mads Stolberg, the founder and CEO of ZTLment, a B2B settlement platform using blockchain to settle payments and invoices automatically in a scalable and decentralized way. Mads is an economist by training, but an entrepreneur by trade. With a passion for sustainability, but a history in trade shift, he recognized that the only way to build a world that runs sustainably is to make supply chain transparent and self-executing. This is what ZTLment tries to achieve, starting with the payment layer and then moving on to a digital handshake, which is converted into a digital contract that self-executes when certain criteria are met. My name is Mark Dencker, and this is my conversation with Mads Stolberg. Just to kick us off, you are obviously the founder and CEO of ZTLment. And just to get started, what is ZTLment and why is it important?
Yeah, so at its core, ZTLment is a B2B payments company. And it's important because B2B trading processes are still stuck in the 20th century. And we've been 20 years into the 21st century now, so we need to do something about that.
That makes sense. But what is different compared to other? I mean, we all know about TransferWise and all these different payment services. PayPal, of course, comes to mind. What's different about ZTLment and all the other guys out there?
For sure. So I think the big difference is that we want to drive a transformation from payments being something that happens at the end of a business transaction to something that actually happens throughout the business workflow. So essentially, you use our smart contract software to digitally sign off on the order. And then from there, we're able to take any event in the subsequent workflow and trigger a payments or some financing based off that event.
And what could that be? So I'm a normal business. I operate, for example, Y-Delta operates business online in general. We have clients all over the world. I shoot an invoice to whatever client that I have. What happens?
Yeah, so you could shoot off the invoice, but before that invoice, typically your buyer has your customer has actually made an order with you. And what we do is that we formally create a digital handshake on that order. And then you don't even have to send off the invoice. You just need to say, I've done the work. And then the buyer can confirm, your customer can confirm, well, yes, that's indeed the case. And then the payment automatically is sent to you in 5 seconds. And the transaction is basically done. It's settled. That's the name as well.
So you do have a sort of agreement layer like HelloSign and all these built in to the platform, or is it sort of once the digital handshake is done, however that is done, then it is assuming that there's an underlying agreement that backs this digital handshake? Or how does that work exactly?
Yeah, so it basically works this way. So it's not HelloSign. It's you can take any underlying contract really. What we want to focus on is connecting that contract to the actual payments execution, because those two things are disconnected right now for basically all companies in the world. Those two things are in two separate systems. And what we believe is interesting with smart contract software and blockchain technology is that you're able to connect those two things very, very tightly. So what you need to do in order to connect them is that as a customer in this setup, you need to be able to sign off on the transaction with your private key. And basically, if we will dig into what is the technically that we do, well, that is what we technically do. We allow the buyer in the transaction to digitally sign off with the private key, such that the transaction can actually be executed on via blockchain technology.
So you're taking a bit of words out of my mouth, because I was just about to get into sort of the digital execution, I think you called it, which obviously a lot of people out there, I'm sure, would think of blockchain immediately when it comes to payments.
Yes.
And just to give a bit of spoiler alert, you guys have built on top of Algorand,
Indeed.
which is another of these Ethereum killers, quote unquote. Just for context for people out there, Algorand is heavily funded. I think the foundation is in Singapore, if I remember, and then there's a operating company in the US, Algorand Inc., if I remember. But the foundation has raised an ungodly amount of money, like so many other blockchain projects, 130 million or so. And they built this sort of, they call it pure proof of stake, if I remember correctly, which has managed to have a throughput of 1,000 transactions per second without compromising on security, decentralization, and all these things, which is important to blockchain. And they use this mix of participant nodes and relay nodes. But to me, I mean, all that is great, sounds awesome, really. That's also what caught my attention about you guys and Algorand, etc. But what's most interesting to me is the applications being built on top. You know, there's so many Ethereum killers out there, but really, when it comes down to it, it's about what is getting built on these different infrastructures. So why did you decide to build on Algorand? What was your motivation behind that?
Yeah, great question and a super important one. So basically, we started out on this journey in August 2020, where I went full time on settlement. And at that point in time, we had already established a partnership with the world's first issuer of e-money to blockchains, because we're in the B2B space. That means we need to be able to use normal money. We don't want to explain companies all these all these difficulties of using stablecoins. So basically, we need to use e-money. And our e-money partner, they gave us two choices, essentially, Ethereum or Algorand. So here we are in August 2020, and we're looking at that choice. Ethereum, there's a lot going on. The roadmap has been set for Ethereum 2.0, but the execution of it and the timelines for that, for sure, uncertain. So basically, you know, we had a proof of stake system that was live versus one that wasn't when it came to Ethereum. And again, it was crucial for us to be able to say, well, we don't use expensive energy when consensus is established in the protocol that we are actually using. So, the choice was pretty easy for us. Besides from that, Algorand does have a number of security benefits, you could say. So the way we view it is that they have kind of decreased functionality. The smart contract programming language is not so incomplete. But the trade-off for that is that it's a lot easier to audit and potentially secure as well. Of course, with the caveat that nothing in this world is secure, but you just have different levels of security. And here Algorand provides a super high one. So again, for the use case that we're targeting here, which is business-to-business trade, we find that to be super important to us.
I find it interesting that the regulators, the authorities, as you mentioned, the e-money license people, they gave you two options, Ethereum and Algorand, I think you mentioned, right?
Yes.
Why do you think that is? Why? I mean, that seems pretty random for someone that follows the blockchain space pretty closely. There could be so many other options that they could choose, like Solana, I don't know, Cardano when they issue their smart contract setup. I mean, there's just so many out there. Why do you think Algorand was on their radar?
So when we've talked about it with them, they were super impressed by the technology. And then just like you have seen in Ethereum, Algorand is definitely taking a page out of the Ethereum playbook in terms of investing in their community. So you kind of had those two things coming together. So I think from their perspective, which was before settlement was launched as well, they saw that, you know, you have all these Ethereum killers, and there will definitely be different blockchains for different use cases. But this was one that potentially could support enterprise solutions in the business to business space. So that was, I imagine, one of the reasons why that they chose to offer Algorand, and that then basically that limited our choice quite significantly. Obviously, we see others being interesting. I think the most obvious one to include here in a Danish context is Concordium that just went live. But the situation for us back then was the same, right? Like Concordium wasn't live yet, and we didn't want to bet our future on something that wasn't live yet. It's important to say we're agnostic. Of course, we're building a lot of the infrastructure here, core infrastructure towards Algorand right now, and making sure that works. But fundamentally, the use case that we see in terms of facilitating business-to-business trade is independent of the underlying blockchain that we're using. And no matter which blockchain it is that we're using underneath, we want it to be the same customer experience.
So down the line, when Ethereum pushes their updates, right now, everybody's anticipating this EIP 1559. I think that's more from a financial perspective because Ethereum becomes deflationary. I don't know if that depends so much on what you guys are doing. But let's say that Ethereum pushes a bunch of updates and they deliver as they promise. Then you will be able to basically implement on top of Ethereum. Like you're not dependent on Algorand 100%. Is that what you're saying?
We're saying that we're blockchain agnostic, as Jason, my co-founder, who's the CTO, likes to say. Everything is just a question of time, energy, and resources, and then you can build it. So of course there will be overhead in terms of making such a transition and also doing that support. But to be honest, most companies don't really care what underlying blockchain is actually used.
I can imagine.
It's the use case that matters. So potentially where it could make a difference is, of course, in terms of what tooling is available to build new and further applications on top of what we're doing. And if we talk about decentralized finance and what is happening there, what types of services are available in the blockchain space that you're building on, essentially. And of course, hands down, there's no question about it. Ethereum is way ahead of a lot of platforms out there right now. But I think a fair way to characterize what is also happening right now with the DeFi space is that there's a lot of speculation going on. Now we call it yield farming, but in Danish, kært barn har mange navne. So I don't know what a good translation is for that, but
it's still the Wild West, and I consider myself someone that is on top of blockchain and crypto in general, following it very closely. But still, to me, every time I open up Twitter, every day I see an update, but I'm like, okay, I did not expect that to be possible today. It's just moving so incredibly fast. And when that happens in an industry like that, not just in blockchain, but in general, I think there's, it's a breeding ground for scammers and people who are cheating others because there's just so much confusion. When things are moving so fast, naturally there's going to be a lot of confusion and people are going to take advantage of that, unfortunately. It's just how humans operate at times, unfortunately.
Exactly. And I completely agree with that. And I know, Mario, you know a lot more of what is happening in the DeFi space than I and Jason we do. But I think in the DeFi space, it seems to me that there's a misconception of how much it will actually take to get this into a product that regular businesses can just use. Like there's so much work to be done in terms of how do you make sure that the solution you have actually fits the existing business workflow. The process that you and we have when we make an order, when you then deliver the goods for that order or that service, there's a whole middleware, you could say, that needs to be built between what businesses are doing today and then what you can technically do with DeFi. And there's a big user experience aspect to that, and then there's a big trust aspect to that, and especially the trust aspect is really about how do we make sure that companies feel comfortable by using these infrastructures, And the way we see it, the biggest and easiest hack is make sure that what we do is within existing regulatory frameworks.
Hmm. And that's also why I wanted to ask you about Algorand and the choice of going down with Algorand, because I think to most people, people not in crypto or blockchain, they know of, maybe they know of Bitcoin. Usually they know about Bitcoin, first of all, digital gold, store value. They understand that. Then they might have heard of Ethereum, where you can build stuff on top of, but I'm sure nobody, very, very few people have heard of Algorand. And targeting businesses, being a business to business platform, I could just imagine that, being built on something that nobody really knows about could be seen as a risk for the CFO or whoever you're talking to. Like Algorand, I've heard of Ethereum maybe, but I've never heard of that. So I'm gonna wait and pass on this opportunity. But you haven't met that pushback from CFOs, for example, in your experience so far.
The goal is not to mention Algorand at all when talking to a CFO.
Right.
Like that, if 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 you end up down that rabbit hole like that, that would be kind of akin to a CFO asking,
Right.
Bank or Luna, if we talk about two, an incumbent and a fintech here in the Danish ecosystem,
Right.
It would be akin to asking them, okay, what database is it that you're using here to do this? What they need to be sure of is that there's a contractual agreement that is in order, that is in place, and that their money is safe. Like that's the big question. How do you make sure that the money is safe? And we believe there are a number of ways that we can ensure that. And basically, we believe the first and foremost important thing to do there is to say, okay, first and foremost, like when you transferred the money to our e-money partner, it's in a well-defined regulatory framework what can happen to those funds. Like there, you're not trusting, a transparency report that maybe not is an accurate picture of what is actually going on. Which is often the case when you talk about stablecoins, right? Like if you talk about stablecoins, then you need to understand the stablecoin before you can actually trust and use it. Whereas when you're in the e-money space, well, e-money is defined as funds under European payments law. So there's a very well-defined structure for that already in terms of what can then happen to those funds.
Nice. So you might not even mention blockchain. I'm assuming, like, for a CFO, even the word blockchain sounds like risk, danger, etc. So
yeah,
you're definitely not talking about Algorand. You might talk about blockchain, but sometimes you're not even talking about blockchain. Just, payments get settled. That's all.
Exactly. And then the smart contract software part of that is basically the if-then statements, right? Like the really interesting thing that the idea that blockchain has brought along is programmable money. The idea that you can basically create the conditions, and when they're true, payments just get automatically executed. Like
Nice.
that idea that's really what we want to sell, right? It's that basic automation. Like it's if the business conditions are true, then you can be certain a payment will be automatically executed. Now, on top of that, you can start to do all kinds of interesting things, and especially we believe, like, once we've solved, and there's still a lot of hurdles to be solved, but once we solve, basic payments and being able to do these partial payments where, one event happens, 5% gets paid, 10% gets paid, and so forth. What would be super interesting to look into is also escrow, because it would be such a beautiful case really to take what blockchain is so good at, which is putting money in escrow. The ICO boom couldn't have happened without escrow being built into Ethereum. So between businesses, you could put it into escrow, and you have smart contract code that is then holding the funds, and then both parties, they understand the business conditions for those being issued. If there is a dispute, you automatically escalate to traditional arbitration mechanisms, which have been in place since the 50s, right? So it's, yeah.
That would be so awesome. I've used escrow.com, which I would assume is the biggest platform for escrow services. And it was a pain in the neck. I mean, first of all, the platform was really, really shitty. If you ask me, escrow.com, they're definitely not a sponsor or anything. And I don't get paid to trash them. It's just because I used them. And it was a very, very bad experience. Then, of course, the whole settlement part, sending money back and forth, an obscure amount of fees being added. No surprise there, but that's not really escrow.com's fault. It's more the Swift IBAN protocol that is just very slow and very tedious to work with, the normal banking system. So if you or someone can build an escrow service on top of blockchain, whether it's Algorand, Ethereum, whatnot, I think most users, they don't really care about the plumbing happening underneath as long as things get settled on the blockchain. That would be a huge improvement in what we have today, I think.
We believe so as well. And we believe also that, from a technical standpoint, it's doable. Like that's something we can definitely do. The challenge comes once we want to make that within a well-defined regulatory framework. So in our dialogue with the Danish Financial Supervisory Authority, we also said, we can actually set the solution, the MVP we have, we could put escrow into that. And early in our dialogue with them, they kind of indicated is probably the right word to use. They haven't they don't really tell you left or right. They just indicate things. But they've indicated that basically no one has taken a stance on how is it regulated, how is the legal point of view if you have funds in a smart contract where you don't hold the funds, I don't hold the funds, there's a piece of code that holds the funds, and the funds are defined as funds under European payments law. Like that really starts to get tricky and difficult. Right. So the big hurdle that we also need to solve, and here I'm talking about, like, if you think of blockchain as a community and wanting to bring some of these benefits forward from decentralized finance and so forth, is you need to solve the technical complexity and map that against the regulatory frameworks we have, or the regulatory frameworks that are forthcoming. Because essentially, the regulation we have in place right now, it wasn't meant for a world where you and we could hold control over our funds digitally by ourselves, and we can transfer them peer-to-peer without any intermediaries. Like, the regulation was just not made for that. The regulation has been made for a situation where there's always a third party which has control over you and my funds, and because that is the case, you need to create protection, right? Like that's at least our interpretation of why is that we have such heavy regulation in the financial services space. Well, part of that is because there's other people who hold your funds, and it's a feature, not a bug, that those people are regulated.
Yeah. What do you see as the biggest constraint right now to your progress, maybe also in the industry as a whole? Is it the technical barriers? The technology is just not there, building on top of blockchain, etc. It is, after all, 12 years old, the blockchain technology, depending on how you count, but more or less 12 years old. Is it the technology barrier, or is it more the regulatory legal barrier that you face? Or is it a mix of both? But what's the main one?
That's a great question. And the way we see it, it's, if we take the industry-wide look, it's the UX barrier. How is it that you, as part of a B2B transaction process, sign off on these transactions with your private key?
Right.
One big barrier. And then the second big barrier is how is this regulated? So we architect it, and then we say, okay, this is how we can build it. How then is that regulated now that we can do peer-to-peer transfers digitally with money? And then comes the third challenge, which is building it. But as we see it, it's kind of in that order right now.
Yeah, and I think that's also my experience. Like once there's sort of a breakthrough technically, then there's a legal problem. Then that gets solved, or there's, the lawyers and the authorities, they map whatever the new technology can do, then they regulate it, then there's a new technology barrier. And it's sort of like chicken and egg all the time. If it's not on the one side, the problem is, it's always on the other side. And that's probably going to continue a never-ending sort of innovation game in that. There are, you mentioned the user experience, which I think is interesting, because when people build products, oftentimes, and even if you build products for years and years, you get surprised how important it is to make it such a seamless experience as possible. A lot of people in blockchain, they are very tech savvy, super engineers in general, and they don't really put, I think, enough thought into how do you get the average Joe to be able to use this, to access this. Because even just holding your private key, as you mentioned a couple of times, that is scary to most people. If I lose it, I lose all my money. It's they don't sleep well at night. I mean, there's a reason why we don't put our dollars into the mattress anymore. We put it in the bank and then trust the bank. I mean, there's a reason why that happened historically. So I think all those things have to be thought about. And there are, for example, people like Taurus Labs that I've worked with on and off. They've solved this. There are other options out there, like wallet providers, basically, that manage to, it's pretty cool what they do. They manage to distribute the private key. So you as a user, you don't have to hold it. All you need to do is log in with your laptop, for example, like I'm using here, log in with your biometric, your fingerprint or whatever, log in with your email password. And what they do then, they split the private key into pieces. So one is on your device, your laptop, for example, if you logged in with that. One is with your, let's say you logged in with Google, then they put a piece of the private key on the Google server, and then a part on their network, or they have sort of an internal network where they distribute codes so people can't easily hack it. And that's, I think, a very, very clever way of doing it. I mean, the theory behind has been around for a long time. They just applied it to blockchain. But at the end of the day, what happens then for the user is that I don't need to hold my key. I'm the only one that can unlock my key, but I don't need to hold it. So if I lose my laptop, for example, I lose all my money. The only thing I need is to be able to verify myself with my fingerprint and with my Google account, for example, if I logged in with Google. And those kind of applications is what I think is going to be needed to get the masses to adopt it, whether it's a CFO who needs to pay or receive payments in the company, whether it's a user and whatnot. But I'm curious to hear if you guys have thought about this, all these different applications that is needed for this mass adoptions to happen. For example, getting the majority of CFOs to be okay with using something like ZTLment, what you guys have built.
For sure, and exactly, we really need to think long and hard about that. I think that way of solving it from a technical perspective is the great thing about that is, like, now you can start getting it potentially in the hands of consumers. As soon as you move into a business context, you just add a layer of complexity that isn't there in the consumer space if you're just talking about capital markets cases where we buy and sell different assets. Because in the business context, everything is part of a workflow. Like, so what we really are thinking about is how do we make it super easy to embed this payments into the workflows. And this is what we believe we found an interesting solution towards, where we basically have private keys stored on the mobile device, and then we can very, very easily integrate and embed the sign-off into different parts of the workflow. So when we think about that, it's really about saying, in the business context, how are we able to, if you will, freeze what is happening for a very brief amount of time, where you're then able to sign off with the private key. Once you've done that, and that could be like, potentially it could be by using a solution like Taurus. We haven't explored that, but basically you sign off really quickly, and then you return into the workflow, and then payments has just been integrated into the workflow now, which means that you can execute the workflow, you can do the accounting of it in real time, because the payments is actually executed as part of it. So I think the brief answer to your question there is that for sure we're thinking about it, and the way we're thinking about it is really, how do we make it easy to embed payments into the B2B workflows?
Makes sense.
Yeah, we hope so. It's
yeah, I mean, and
it's not trivial, we would say.
But what I really like about your approach also is that you build, I wouldn't call it an MVP, but a first version of the product. You're going out to real people, real CFOs, real whatever decision makers, and getting their feedback. So many people, and Ethereum is certainly one of them. So many teams, they sit, build, come up with a theoretical framework. I think the best example of that is Cardano, that is very, very focused on sort of the academic research, having sound ideas before they implement anything. And that's why, 4 years in, Cardano still doesn't have smart contracts deployed to their chain, and people are not really building anything on Cardano. 4 years or whatever years in now. And you can have different examples within blockchain with people doing that. Might be good reasons for it, but I mean, if you really want to adopt technology, you have to start somewhere, iterate, learn, go back to the drawing board, deploy a new version, and a little bit back and forth. And that's exactly what you guys are doing, which I think is really the key to actually provide a solution that people want, and not just guessing that this is what people want. Well, my question basically was, in terms of B2B and blockchain, I think a lot of people, they certainly see the opportunity in the B2B space, but what we know most about, and what has gotten the most attention for sure, is more the consumer side and the retail investor side. DeFi is massive, of course. Yield farming, as you mentioned, is the latest hot topic within DeFi. There's NFTs, which became incredibly popular in recent months. Are there any, you mentioned escrow, for example, are there any other like use cases within the B2B space using blockchain where people can like, oh yeah, I can definitely see myself using this on my job, of course, when it's B2B?
Oh, that's a hard question. And the reason why I think it's hard is because, can I see myself using blockchain is somewhat of a redundant question somehow. Like, if you replace blockchain with database in that question, it's kind of, it's a question that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Like, can you see yourself use a database in your work? Yes, for sure, I can. I do that all the time. So it's kind of like, what functionality does it provide that wasn't there before? And for us, definitely automated market makers is like, it's crazy cool, like hands down. And we actually started, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it doesn't matter. We started the company 2 pivots or 2 simplifications ago. So in August 2020, we really wanted to create an automated market maker for foreign exchange. Because imagine that you have a lot of small businesses in Denmark that needs British pounds, and you have a lot of small businesses in Britain that needs Danish kroner. Well, then you can have an automated market maker basically net those flows against each other before the companies, they go in the market for the net difference, which is what all the big global conglomerates, they do via their centralized treasuries, right? So that was really what we saw as a super exciting case, was basically creating an automated market for something like that. Then we got feedback from people who are a lot smarter than we are and saying, that is beautiful on paper, but how do you sell the first phone, right?
Right.
So here we are, 2 simplifications later. Then we started on escrow, learned that there are regulatory complexities there, and now we've simplified to only focus on basically payments, being able to create the digital handshake on the order, and then take it then subsequently and do the payments. But once we have that, then you can start to build all these really interesting things on top. And definitely when it comes to the decentralized finance space, automated market makers, that's going to be the next thing people are talking about, I believe. Maybe they, arguably they already are, but it hasn't hit mainstream yet, the same way that NFTs at least has, because you haven't had maybe a $70 million piece of automated market maker being sold. But maybe we'll have that soon.
I think AMMs, DeFi in general, in so many ways, is a godsend gift to the people. Not the incumbents, not the big banks and people who are sitting on big order books and taking incredible amount of fees, but to the people, it's just amazing. I mean, everyone basically who has cash in the bank, they can provide their liquidity at very, very low risk. And I'm sure AMMs is only going to get more secure, more developed from here. I'll be surprised if not, at least. And with that, you don't really run a large risk by providing liquidity to a liquidity pool, which is the underlying part or piece to AMMs. And with that, you yield. So that is completely dispatched from the central banking system and banking system. You are your own bank, and not only do you hold your funds, you can also basically lend it out, provide liquidity at very, very low risk as this space gets more and more involved. And that's just beautiful. I mean, it's sort of like thinking about money and all these things. Not that we have to go down that rabbit hole, but instead of incentivizing the masses to spend their money by continuously printing it and creating inflation and whatnot, you incentivize people to save and be mindful about their money. Of course, there are certain issues with that to economic growth and all this, but the fact that there's not just excessive spending and more spending is better, I think that on balance tends to be a better world than just this obscure focus on continuously, printing money more. Instead, you can save with this new setup, this new system that we have with AMMs and crypto in general. People can be mindful about their money and actually yield from it. Yeah, that's a whole different discussion, I guess, that we can talk about.
Whole discussion, like the possibilities it opens up, both for consumers, but definitely also for businesses. And the thing is, like, when we talk about this at scale, we just need to remember where the big money is moved, right? Like the B2B space, at least if you talk about cross-border trade, then that's where 95% plus of all the money that is sent back and forth across borders is between organizations, right? It's not between people and organizations or people and people. It's
true.
It's organizations buying and selling from each other, or organizations buying and selling each other for themselves. If we have the big conglomerates like Maersk. So again, I'm completely on board, kind of on the vision and the opportunities that opens. We can also just see from the engagement we've had so far in building what we have right now and understanding, where does the line lie from a regulatory point of view with what we have right now. There's a lot of work to be done in order to realize that future. Like, that's going to be a 5-10 year thing at least, if not the rest of our working life.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, for sure. But I mean, the building blocks are getting there, right? Let's take settlement. Like, you guys are basically getting organizations, businesses to deposit their whatever money that they have currently in the bank to be able to pay for their goods and services. It's once that, let's say, that is getting implemented at scale, settlement, like everybody starts to use settlement, right? Then you have a lot of money basically being locked and deposited on the blockchain. Then you have that building block you can build on top of with the whole yield farming and getting yield to people. That's exactly what all these different consumer like neo banks are doing when they add crypto, right? They allow people to deposit euros, dollars, etc., just like you are doing with organizations, and then they offer this yield product or getting interest on whatever deposits that you have. So I think slowly but surely, it will certainly take time, as you say, but slowly but surely, we are building these building blocks. And that's what I love about what you guys are doing also, starting small and then building on top slowly but surely, which I
For
think is
sure.
super awesome.
And that's where we believe it's interesting what is happening in parallel. Like I think we're both economists by training, right? So it's always about figuring, where's your comparative advantage, which often boils down to what isn't that a lot of people are not doing right now that we can help. What are the problems we can help solve that others maybe aren't working full speed on? And this is where we're saying, like, there's some user experience aspect to it, there's some regulatory aspect to it before businesses can start to use this. And those are the challenges we want to solve, because then we believe like some of the technical work that is going on right now and that has been going on will, the ideas and concepts will have been turned into hardened production grade infrastructures that have been battle tested with real funds going through for years, right? And then you can kind of start to connect those two things out in the future. But again, this is definitely down the line.
For sure. So just going back a bit, you build on top of Algorand. To my understanding, you received a small grant from Algorand as well. So you are maybe close to them. How do you see that going forward? Like, so you mentioned that you might build on Ethereum, but how is the fundraising about like with Algorand and all these things? Because you hear all these different crypto companies, they raise an obscure amount of money. You guys are a bit different because you're basically bridging sort of the, let's call it the old financial system with a settlement layer on the blockchain. So you're kind of in between, I guess. You're not a, if you want, a pure blockchain company. So you probably don't raise an ICO. I don't expect that you guys are introducing a coin or anything. So how sort of the fundraising game when you are in sort of in between these two things, which I think a lot of companies are. They see the benefit of blockchain, but I mean, we are also living in the real world. So we need to implement something for the real world. So how did that, what is your experience with that?
Yeah, how to do that balancing act.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think maybe going back, the funding we have received so far was from an investment from an American VC, and they invest heavily into the Algorand ecosystem, but they do also make investments into companies that are blockchain agnostic and do other stuff. And then we received a grant from the Danish Innovation Fund. So, I mean, that's, you could say, classical startup funding, at least when you're a Danish company. The investment we got as part of the Algorand Europe Accelerator program, which took place here in the spring. And to be completely honest with you, we have been heads down in business product development combined with understanding where is the regulatory dividing line together with the Danish FSA these past 6 months. So we haven't really been out there talking to a lot of VCs yet. But I mean, I think you're right in terms of we have a leg in each camp, if you will. We're building on permissionless blockchain, but we want to make it really, really business friendly, and we know what that will take, and yeah, we'll see what the experience will be on moving forward with on the funding side there. So far, we have received interest from a couple of VCs in Europe, and we're super positive about that, given that we really haven't done any marketing right now. It also seems I gotta say that some of them out there seem to have a pretty well-tuned deal flow machine in terms of making sure to get in touch with founders and get the first conversations.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I guess you could basically go out and raise money from a lot of more people than other startups, because you are sort of in between, right? You could go head focus into more blockchain focused VCs or investors in general. You could go more the fintech route. Yeah, there's just so many avenues that you guys could pursue.
Yeah, the way we see it is basically, what kind of competencies is it that we need in order to become successful? Like, we understand the odds of a startup. Like, an economist by training, Jason, my co-founder, is an engineer. We know the math there. So what is it that will be needed for us to succeed? And the way we see it, there's some knowledge and skills. On the knowledge side, it's really, people having built or been engaged in B2B SaaS, in fintech or supply chain. As part of supply chain, with the sustainability transformation we're seeing, maybe experience in that. So that's kind of on the knowledge side. And then there's on the skill side, where it's people who have helped take companies from early stages to Series A, which is the next big journey, but of course, preferably going beyond that. But that's really what we what we're looking for. If they do blockchain as well, great. If they don't, also great.
Yeah, because I mean, in B2B in general, what's hard about that, I think, is that you can build an excellent product, you can do a lot of marketing, advertising, whatever, but there's just this personal layer where you need to communicate directly with, let's say, the CFO who sits with the invoicing and all that, and convince them. Like, there's just a certain level of outreach that you typically have to do in B2B, which means that the competencies that you need is not so much someone that has built, I don't know, a consumer product, Facebook, whatever, that scaled to millions and billions of users. More people that are heavily into, supply chain, as you say, the B2B space, and all that, in order for you guys to scale, truly scale, and get a lot of organizations on. But that also brings to mind that you have a history in Tradeshift, which in many ways are doing similar things. How, maybe you can talk about that, and if you can't, just let us know. But how is that? I mean, from a superficial perspective, what you guys are doing is very much disrupting something like Tradeshift, unless Tradeshift, of course, adopts a similar technology like you guys are building.
And so, yeah, and the question being, is that indeed the case?
Is that indeed the case? And what is the difference between you guys, Settlement and Tradeshift?
Yeah, for sure. Great question as well. And we definitely see something, the solution we have is something that Tradeshift could embed. So Tradeshift, they have a cloud platform, and essentially they allow companies to connect. So their go-to-market for the past 10 years has been going to these huge enterprises, like we're talking some of the biggest companies in the world. And then they have made a solution where it's super easy for them to get their suppliers onboarded. And then the suppliers, they do the whole ordering and invoicing process via Tradeshift. And that way you avoid physical documents. Like, and that's really the starting point. We got to realize that, right? Like, so you can think of it as Tradeshift has really, and their competitors are solving challenges in the informational supply chain layer. Then there are lots of challenges in the physical supply chain there. And here you can think of someone like TradeLens that is solving those. And then you have the financial supply chain where you actually connect that to the payments execution. And what we want to say is that, well, instead of the payment happening at the end of a B2B transaction, let's start the payments process when the workflow actually starts between the two companies, and then just execute payments as we go along. Because that also builds up trust, right? So you know, if you do X and then you get a little bit of money for doing X from me as a customer, then it builds trust that I will also make sure to pay if you ship the goods and so forth. So I think the big difference really is we're providing payments technology. Like we are in the financial supply chain in the sense that this is actually funds that are being moved around, and not just information. And you have seen over the past 10 years, and Tradeship is a big case of that, companies digitizing the informational process. And that's also where, like, you're now seeing blockchain players out there saying that we can digitize this supply chain process with blockchain. And you know, when I was in Tradeship, the little bit provocative stance on that is, yeah, but you can also do that on cloud, right? Where blockchain really becomes interesting is in the financial supply chain, because that's when you start to connect everything that you're doing in the informational supply chain and the physical supply chain with the actual payments and financial and settlement execution. So I hope that kind of explains the difference. Otherwise, let's dig further in, because it's quite important actually for us to be able to make that distinction clear.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, a burning question that I had when you said all that is, do you think we will ever enter a world where auditors, accountants, they don't need to do reconciliation of their books?
For sure, for sure, for sure.
Is that sort of the end goal if we had to set a post out there in the future? Is that you know, there's not all these different discrepancies between the invoices that has been sent out and what happened then afterwards in the real world, or how when payments were received and whatnot goes wrong when, you know, between the invoicing process right now? Is the end goal? Yeah.
Absolutely yes to that question.
Yeah.
The whole reconciliation process becomes redundant. Maybe we need to articulate that a little clearer, but that's really what becomes redundant, because right now you have a cloud platform like Tradeship, but it's disconnected to the actual payments execution. Right? Those two are not reconciled. You have to do that sometimes manually afterwards, sometimes the automated solution. You're starting to implement AI into that and so forth. But what we want to say, like, for 5,000 years, like ever since commerce started, that you had kind of people putting things into stone and saying this is the bill that you need to pay, and then you gave a bag of gold or something like that. All the way up till now, the information systems and the financial system have been disconnected. The thing that is so interesting, if we take the really long view, is that with blockchain, you really tie those two things together. The information, like the digital handshake and the payments execution, becomes two sides of the same coin for the first time. And we believe that's extremely powerful. And that's also what gets us excited about doing this, is that we can actually implement that for regular companies, maybe without explaining, you know, 5,000 years of history, but just saying, you know, here's the settlement, it's executed in 5 seconds, and you can embed it basically anywhere you want into the B2B workflow.
Right. Awesome. So what I always like to ask people here is what excites them right now? I mean, this could be, of course, within crypto and blockchain. We talked at length about that, but it could be something else in fintech and beyond, really. What excites you right now, Mads, in the world that we live in? Italy just won the Euro, so maybe that excites you. I don't know, but it could be anything. You know, what do you see like, okay, this is really going to change?
Yeah, I love that question. Honestly, completely different place, but the sustainability transformation.
Mhm.
Like we're getting out of COVID. I just got my first vaccine shot
Congrats.
today. So now it's about tackling the next major level boss that we're meeting here in the world, which is the sustainability transformation that needs to happen in supply chains, right?
Nice.
And if we just look at the industry, so we basically started looking at what industries are importing and exporting, especially exporting a lot here from Denmark because we're based in Copenhagen, and one of them is food and beverages, and we've digged into that industry vertical to start out with. A, because both Jason and I like food and beverages, and B, because there's so many interesting things happening in it right now. And the sustainability transformation there is just so evident. And it's even exemplified. Like my parents bought a subscription from Simple Feast before I did, right? So this subscription where you get 3 meal boxes that are vegetarian each week, like
They're also quite
that's,
delicious, I must say. I'm a subscriber as well.
you know, it's really, really good stuff. But that transformation is amazing. Like it's just there's a sustainability angle to it, and then there's the fact that you're basically changing the buying habits at the consumer level, where you're going over to something that is subscription now. It's not something that you go into the supermarket, which means the predictability of consumption becomes much easier, and that potentially can translate all the way through the food supply chain, which would be great because then we can start to do a lot of interesting things in that supply chain, and we can start to say, if you're sustainable, then you maybe get accelerated payments, or if you're sustainable, then you automatically get a better price. That's already the case today in many instances.
Nice.
Yeah, but basically, so what excites me, big one, sustainability transformation that is ongoing. More nerdy towards the B2B payments product that we're building is definitely, you know, central banks and regulators. You could almost say finally taking the blockchain space really serious. Like, of course, there's been exception to this rule. I believe in Singapore, they have done amazing work for years in terms of actually engaging with people that are building technology. But the movement that you saw there was actually the motivation for me also reaching out to Jason and saying, well, now is the time that we do something. We met each other in 2017. We did a hackathon together, and we've been talking since then. And now blockchain technology has matured a lot since 17.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have central banks and regulators. They're finally getting into this game. And our conversation with the Danish FSA, we definitely believe that is also showing there. They're showing a level of curiosity that we frankly hadn't expected. It's been really, really great to see that. So that's the second thing that excites me. Is basically we got the brass joining the movement. Maybe that's not how all people they see that, but we overall see that as a super positive thing.
It's awesome, Mads. And that's why I love that to ask a question in the end also, because you never know what comes up. You know, one thing is what people are working on daily basis, but they have many other interests. We're all people here with a lot of curiosities in many different fields.
Yes.
So congratulations, Mads, on all your progress. We look forward to continue following you and seeing your continuous progress in settlement, sustainability, and beyond. Where do people find you, or settlement for that matter? On social media, where are you guys active?
Yeah, so we haven't been very active so far. We're going to change that in the autumn here. But yeah, find us on LinkedIn. is probably the best place to follow what is going on. Do please connect with me and reach out if you have any questions or follow-ups. Happy to engage there. And then besides from that, Mark, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure and great conversation here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mads. All the best to you and Jason. Take care.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.